March 14, 1978. Kubinka Air Base, 50 kilometers west of Moscow. Inside a concrete briefing room buried 3 meters underground. Colonel Viktor Petrov's hands trembled as he held the intelligence document. At 43 years old, the chief radar systems engineer for the Soviet Air Defense Forces had spent 2 decades designing and analyzing fighter aircraft radar systems. He had personally overseen the development of the MiG-25 Smerch A radar. He knew what was possible. He knew what was fantasy. The paper in his hands described fantasy. The photographs spread across the steel table showed an American F-15 Eagle, its nose cone removed, revealing the flat plate antenna array of the APG-63 radar system. Technical specifications accompanied the images. Track while scan capability, pulse Doppler processing, look down, shoot down capability, against targets flying as low as 60 meters. The document claimed the system could simultaneously track 24 airborne targets while engaging 8 of them with missiles. Petrov laughed, not a polite chuckle, but a genuine belly laugh that echoed off the concrete walls. He turned to Major General Anatoly Grechko, commander of the 16th Air Defense Division, and said what every engineer in that room was thinking. The Americans are feeding us disinformation. This is propaganda meant to demoralize our pilots. What Petrov didn't know was that every specification in that document was conservative. What he couldn't have imagined was that within 4 years, Israeli F-15's would validate every impossible claim in actual combat, shooting down 40 Syrian aircraft without a single loss. Within a decade, Soviet engineers would be frantically reverse engineering captured electronics from a downed Iranian F-14, desperately trying to close a technology gap that had grown wider than anyone in that Kubinka briefing room could comprehend. The laughter would die. The disbelief would transform into something closer to despair. The story of how Moscow's finest aviation engineers went from mockery to grudging terror begins not in 1978 but 13 years earlier, in the humid workshops of the McDonnell Douglas plant in St. Louis, Missouri. The United States Air Force had issued a request for proposals for a new air superiority fighter. The Vietnam War had exposed critical weaknesses in American fighter design. The F-4 Phantom, backbone of American air power, lacked an internal gun and depended entirely on radar-guided missiles that performed poorly in close combat. American pilots needed something better. They needed something that could dominate the skies against the growing Soviet threat. McDonnell Douglas engineers, led by chief designer David Lewis, began with a radical premise. Every previous fighter had been designed around its weapons or its engine. The F-15 would be designed around its radar. The APG-63 radar system, developed by Hughes Aircraft Company under the direction of Chief Engineer Thomas Amley, would be the aircraft's primary weapon. Everything else, the twin Pratt & Whitney F-100 turbofan engines producing 25,000 pounds of thrust each, the advanced fly-by-wire flight controls, the enormous wing area of 608 square feet, existed to position that radar antenna where it needed to be. The Soviet Union had been building fighters differently. Soviet design philosophy, shaped by decades of resource constraints and different tactical doctrine, prioritized simplicity and mass production. The MiG-25 Foxbat, which had so terrified Western intelligence when it appeared in 1964, used vacuum tube technology in its radar because Soviet planners believed tubes were more resistant to electromagnetic pulse from nuclear weapons. The Smerch A radar that Petrov had helped develop could track one target at a time at a maximum range of 100 kilometers against high-altitude targets. It was powerful. It was reliable. It was also fundamentally limited by 1950s-era technology. American engineers had taken a different path. The APG-63 used a planar array antenna with electronic scanning capability. Instead of mechanically moving the antenna to search different areas of sky, the system used phase shifters to steer the radar beam electronically. This meant the radar could rapidly switch between multiple functions, searching for new targets, tracking known contacts, guiding missiles, and jamming enemy radars. The heart of the system was its digital signal processor, built using integrated circuits that could perform millions of calculations per second. This computational power enabled true track-while-scan capability. The technical specifications were staggering. The APG-63 operated in X-band frequencies between 8 and 12 gigahertz. Its antenna measured 36 inches in diameter. Peak power output reached 10 kilowatts. But raw power mattered less than processing sophistication. The system could detect a 5-square-meter radar cross-section target at ranges exceeding 160 kilometers. Once detected, the radar could initiate tracks on up to 24 separate targets, continuously updating their positions, velocities, and threat priorities. From those 24 tracks, the pilot could designate 8 for simultaneous engagement with AIM-7 Sparrow, or AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles. What made this possible was pulse Doppler processing. Traditional radars struggled to detect aircraft flying low against ground clutter. The radar returns from terrain overwhelmed the returns from aircraft. Pulse Doppler radar exploited the Doppler effect, the frequency shift caused by moving objects. By analyzing the frequency of returned radar pulses, the system could distinguish moving aircraft from stationary ground features. An aircraft flying at 600 knots produced a distinct Doppler shift. The ground did not. The APG-63 could filter out ground clutter and detect fighters flying as low as 60 meters above terrain. Soviet engineers had theoretical knowledge of these concepts. They understood pulse Doppler processing. They knew about track-while scan capability. What they couldn't believe was that Americans had actually built a working system and made it reliable enough for operational deployment. The computational power required seemed impossible to package in an aircraft nose cone. The cooling requirements for that many integrated circuits seemed insurmountable. The software complexity seemed beyond what any military system could reliably manage. The first F-15A Eagle achieved initial operational capability with the first tactical fighter wing at Langley Air Force Base, Virginia, in January 1976. The aircraft carried tail number 76001. Its first operational pilot was Captain Roger Wells, a Vietnam veteran with 147 combat missions in F-4 Phantoms. Wells later recalled his first training sortie against 4 aggressor aircraft simulating Soviet tactics. I tracked all 4 simultaneously at ranges where they couldn't even see me. I designated 2 for engagement, simulated launching missiles, designated the next 2, simulated launches again. The fight was over before it began. I'd never experienced anything like it. The Soviet technology gap was real and growing. While American engineers were building systems with integrated circuits containing thousands of transistors, Soviet electronics industry still struggled to mass-produce reliable chips with hundreds of transistors. The gap wasn't due to lack of knowledge. Soviet scientists understood the theory perfectly, but to manufacturing limitations. The Soviet semiconductor industry, centralized and focused on strategic weapons, couldn't produce the quantity and quality of components required for advanced fighter radar systems. The irony was that Soviet intelligence correctly identified American capabilities, but Soviet engineers correctly identified Soviet limitations, then assumed American limitations matched their own. This cognitive trap, projecting one's own constraints onto adversaries, would persist even as evidence accumulated. The evidence began accumulating in June 1979. The Imperial Iranian Air Force, equipped with American weapons before the Islamic Revolution, engaged in border skirmishes with Soviet-backed Iraqi forces. Iranian F-14 Tomcats, equipped with the even more advanced AWG-9 radar system, shot down 6 Iraqi aircraft in 3 days without losses. The AWG-9 could track 24 targets and engage 6 simultaneously. Soviet observers reported these results to Moscow with notes of concern. Soviet analysts developed multiple theories to explain Iranian success. Perhaps Iraqi pilots were poorly trained. Perhaps the engagements occurred under ideal conditions with Iranian aircraft attacking from superior positions. Perhaps the Iranians were lying about their kill ratios. What analysts couldn't accept was that American radar technology had achieved a genuine revolution in air combat capability. The turning point came in June 1982, in the skies over Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. Israeli F-15's and F-16's, equipped with APG-63 and APG-66 radars respectively, engaged Syrian Air Force MiG-21s, MiG-23s, and MiG-25s in what would become the largest air battle since the Korean War. Over 4 days, Israeli pilots shot down 86 Syrian aircraft while losing 0 fighters in air-to-air combat. Captain Moshe Melnik, flying F-15D tail number 957, participated in the first day's combat. At 29 years old, Melnik had logged 800 hours in F-15s. His radar warning receiver screamed as multiple Syrian aircraft converged on his formation. His APG-63 painted 23 contacts at ranges between 40 and 90 kilometers. Melnick selected the four highest priority threats, MiG-23s approaching at high speed, and launched four AIM-7M Sparrow missiles in 12 seconds. All four missiles guided successfully. All four Syrian aircraft exploded before their pilots knew they were under attack. Melnick's radar immediately shifted to tracking the next group of threats. He would shoot down 6 Syrian aircraft that day without ever seeing any of them visually. The battle was devastating for Soviet military prestige. Syrian pilots flew Soviet aircraft, used Soviet tactics, and relied on Soviet ground-based radar networks. None of it mattered. Israeli pilots, exploiting the superior situational awareness provided by American radar systems, hunted Syrian formations with methodical efficiency. Syrian pilots reported feeling helpless, engaging enemies they couldn't detect at ranges where their own weapons were useless. Soviet Air Defense Forces Commander Marshal Alexander Koldunov ordered an immediate investigation. The Marshal, a World War II ace with 63 credited kills, had spent his career believing Soviet fighters could match any Western aircraft through superior tactics and pilot courage. The Bakaa Valley results shattered that confidence. He assigned Colonel General Pavel Kutakov, deputy commander of Soviet Air Forces, to lead a technical assessment team. Kutakov's team included Viktor Petrov, the same engineer who had laughed at F-15's specifications 4 years earlier. Petrov wasn't laughing anymore. The team reviewed gun camera footage from Syrian aircraft, radar recordings from Syrian ground stations, and debriefing reports from surviving pilots. The evidence was inescapable. American aircraft were detecting, tracking, and engaging Soviet fighters at ranges exceeding Soviet radar capabilities by factors of 2 or 3. Syrian pilots described Israeli fighters appearing from nowhere, launching missiles before Syrian radars even detected threats. Petrov wrote in his official report, filed August 15, 1982, "Analysis confirms American fighter radar systems possess capabilities matching or exceeding specifications provided by technical intelligence. The APG-63 system demonstrates reliable track-while-scan functionality against multiple targets under combat conditions. Soviet fighter radar development lags American capabilities by estimated 5 to 7 years minimum. Closing this gap requires fundamental advances in digital processing technology, advances our electronics industry cannot currently deliver." The report landed on desks throughout Soviet military leadership like a bomb. Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, chief of the General Staff, demanded answers from Soviet aviation industry leaders. How had Americans achieved such a massive technological lead? When could Soviet fighters match American capabilities? Alexei Fyodorov, director of the Fazotron Design Bureau, responsible for Soviet fighter radars, provided a grim assessment in September 1982. At 56 years old, Fyodorov had overseen development of every major Soviet fighter radar since 1960. He understood the constraints intimately. "Comrade Marshal, the Americans have surpassed us in 3 critical areas: digital signal processing, solid-state electronics manufacturing, and software development. Our industry can produce individual components matching American specifications. We cannot mass-produce them reliably. Our integrated circuits have failure rates 3 to 5 times higher than American equivalents. Our software development practices lag 10 years behind American capabilities. Building systems as complex as APG-63 requires not just advanced technology, but advanced manufacturing discipline we lack." What Fyodorov couldn't say directly, but what everyone in that meeting understood, was that Soviet centralized planning had created the gap. American aerospace companies competed for military contracts, driving innovation. Companies like Hughes Aircraft, Westinghouse, and Raytheon pushed boundaries to win programs. Soviet design bureaus operated as state monopolies, protected from competition, focused on meeting production quotas rather than advancing performance. The irony was that Soviet scientists and engineers were individually as talented as their American counterparts. The Soviets had launched Sputnik first. Soviet mathematicians had made groundbreaking contributions to computer science. But institutional structures, resource allocation decisions, and strategic priorities had channeled Soviet technical talent away from the digital revolution that was transforming American military technology. Soviet leadership demanded crash programs to close the gap. The MiG-31 Zaslon radar, under development since 1975, received additional funding. Engineers increased target tracking capacity from 10 to 20 contacts. They improved processing algorithms to enable engagement of 4 targets simultaneously with R-33 missiles. The system achieved operational capability in 1985. It represented a genuine advancement over previous Soviet radars. It still couldn't match the APG-63's capabilities, and the APG-63 was already being superseded by the APG-70, with even more processing power and longer detection ranges. American advantages compounded. The F-15C variant, introduced in 1979, incorporated the APG-70 radar with programmable signal processor. This allowed software updates to improve performance without hardware changes. When Soviet engineers developed new jamming techniques, American engineers countered with software patches uploaded during routine maintenance. Soviet systems, built with hardwired processing, required hardware modifications to adapt to new threats. Lieutenant General Vladimir Mikhailov, commander of the 4th Air Defense Army, summarized the dilemma in a 1984 strategy document. American fighter radars provide such significant advantage in beyond visual range combat that numerical superiority no longer guarantees victory. Soviet doctrine assumes meeting engagements where both sides detect each other simultaneously. American systems detect our aircraft first, engage first, potentially destroy our formations before we achieve weapon launch parameters. This fundamentally changes air combat calculations. We estimate NATO air forces gain effective force multiplication of 3 to 5 times in beyond visual range scenarios. The strategic implications were profound. Soviet air defense strategy had relied on numerical superiority, building more fighters than NATO could field, accepting higher losses in exchange for overwhelming numbers. If American radar advantages meant each NATO fighter could engage multiple Soviet aircraft before Soviet fighters could respond, numerical superiority became meaningless. NATO didn't need more aircraft. They needed to maximize the effectiveness of aircraft they had. Soviet responses took multiple forms. Tactically, Soviet doctrine shifted toward low-altitude penetration and ground-controlled intercepts, attempting to negate American radar advantages by operating in clutter-heavy environments where pulse Doppler systems performed less effectively. Strategically, Soviet air defenses invested heavily in surface-to-air missile systems and ground-based radars to compensate for fighter radar limitations. If Soviet fighters couldn't detect NATO aircraft first, perhaps ground stations could provide targeting information via data link. These adaptations proved partially successful. Soviet SA-10 Grumble surface-to-air missile systems, deployed beginning in 1980, could engage aircraft at ranges exceeding 150 kilometers. Ground-based radars, with larger antennas and more powerful transmitters than aircraft systems, could detect targets at extended ranges. But data link systems to share that information with airborne fighters remained primitive. Soviet fighters might know NATO aircraft were approaching, but they couldn't exploit that knowledge without airborne radar systems capable of tracking targets and guiding missiles. The technology chase continued throughout the 1980s. Soviet engineers studied every piece of Western radar equipment they could acquire. When the Islamic Republic of Iran Air Force began selling spare parts from its American-equipped inventory after 1984, Soviet intelligence purchased whatever they could through intermediaries. Components from F-14 AWG-9 radars reached Soviet laboratories. Engineers disassembled integrated circuits, photographed them under electron microscopes, analyzed their architecture. Major General Yuri Yashin, director of the Central Scientific Research Institute of Radioelectronics, supervised this technical intelligence exploitation. His engineers learned volumes about American manufacturing techniques, circuit design philosophies, and software architectures. Learning, however, didn't equal replicating. Yashin later recalled in a 1997 interview, "We could understand how Americans built their systems. Understanding didn't give us ability to manufacture equivalent components. Our fabrication facilities couldn't achieve the tolerances required. Our quality control couldn't match their consistency. We were studying systems built by industrial base 20 years more advanced than ours." By 1985, the gap between American and Soviet fighter radar capabilities had become an accepted fact in Soviet military planning. The laughter that greeted initial intelligence reports about the F-15's APG-63 system had been replaced by grim acknowledgement of American superiority. Soviet fighter pilots trained for scenarios where they would face adversaries with better situational awareness, longer-range weapons, and first-shot advantage. Soviet tactics emphasized teamwork, ground support, and exploiting any momentary advantages in close combat if they could survive to reach close combat. The F-15 demonstrated its radar's lethality repeatedly throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Israeli pilots continued accumulating kills without losses through 1985, eventually reaching a total score exceeding 50 Syrian aircraft destroyed with 0 F-15 losses in air-to-air combat. Saudi Arabian F-15Cs shot down 2 Iranian F-4 Phantoms in June 1984, detecting and engaging them at ranges where Iranian radars showed empty skies. United States Air Force F-15Cs destroyed 28 Iraqi aircraft during Operation Desert Storm in 1991, with Iraqi pilots describing helpless terror as invisible enemies destroyed their formations. Colonel Rick Tolini, USAF, commanded the 58th Tactical Fighter Squadron during Desert Storm. His squadron's F-15Cs scored 19 confirmed kills without losses. Tolini later described typical engagements. Iraqi fighters would launch and we'd see them on radar immediately. Sometimes we'd track 8 or 10 contacts simultaneously. We'd sort targets, decide which ones posed the greatest threat, and engage them in sequence. Many Iraqi pilots never knew we were there. Their radar warning receivers would detect our missile guidance radars only seconds before impact. The technology gap was so overwhelming that actual combat felt almost unfair. That sense of technological unfairness was exactly what Soviet engineers had refused to believe in 1978. The idea that any military system could be so superior that combat became one-sided slaughter contradicted Soviet doctrine and Soviet pride. Soviet engineers had built the world's fastest interceptor, the MiG-25. Soviet designers had created the AK-47, the world's most reliable rifle. Soviet scientists had launched humanity's first satellite. Surely Soviet aviation technology could match American fighters. What they couldn't accept was that matching American fighters required more than talented engineers and adequate funding. It required an entire industrial ecosystem capable of manufacturing advanced electronics at scale with consistent quality. It required software development practices that emphasized reliability, modularity, and maintainability. It required procurement systems that rewarded innovation rather than production quota fulfillment. It required all the complex institutional structures that enable advanced technology development, structures that couldn't be commanded into existence by ministerial decree. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991 before Soviet fighters achieved radar parity with American systems. The Su-27's N001 radar could track 10 targets and engage 2 simultaneously when it entered service in 1985. Impressive by Soviet standards, still inferior to the F-15's APG-63 from a decade earlier. Russian engineers continued closing the gap through the 1990s and 2000s. The Su-25S, introduced in 2014, features the Urbis E radar with capabilities approaching modern American systems. But the F-15 continues flying with upgraded APG-82 radars, maintaining technological edges through continuous modernization impossible for earlier Soviet designs. Viktor Petrov, the engineer who laughed at F-15 specifications in 1978, retired from Russian military service in 1994. He spent his final years consulting for aerospace companies trying to commercialize Soviet-era technology. In a 2003 interview with a Russian aviation magazine, he reflected on that Kubinka briefing room moment. We laughed because we couldn't imagine that Americans had solved problems we couldn't solve. Our mistake was assuming that what was impossible for us was impossible for everyone. Americans didn't have better scientists. They had better systems for translating scientific knowledge into operational technology. That's the lesson I learned too late to matter. The F-15 remains in service with the United States Air Force, Israeli Air Force, Saudi Royal Air Force, and other operators as of 2025. The aircraft's radar systems have been upgraded continuously, incorporating technologies that would have seemed like science fiction to engineers in 1978. The APG-82 radar, standard on current F-15EX variants, can track far more than 24 targets and provide synthetic aperture ground mapping, electronic warfare capabilities, and data link integration. The baseline capability that Soviet engineers couldn't believe, Track 24, Engage 8, has become the minimum standard that modern fighters must exceed. The deeper legacy of Soviet disbelief about F-15 radar capabilities extends beyond technical specifications. It illustrates how technological surprise works in military competition. Adversaries tend to mirror image their own capabilities onto opponents, assuming everyone faces similar constraints. When one side achieves genuine breakthrough, the other side's first response is often denial rather than adaptation. That denial delays effective countermeasures, allowing technological advantages to compound. Modern military analysts study the F-15 radar story as a case study in technology assessment and intelligence analysis. The lesson isn't about radar systems specifically. It's about the danger of letting one's own limitations define expectations about adversary capabilities. Soviet engineers knew what Soviet industry could build. They assumed American industry faced similar limits. That assumption, comfortable and intuitive, was catastrophically wrong. The laughter in the Kubinka briefing room in March 1978 was the sound of an entire military establishment confronting a reality they couldn't accept until Syrian and Iraqi pilots paid the price for Soviet misconceptions in blood and burning aircraft.